Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And thank you, Ted. You know what's really exciting about getting into the scriptures like that and looking deep? It may sound a little technical if you don't pay close attention. But what are we called to do? Above all else, we are called to know Jesus more and more and more. Of everything you can do in your whole life, that is the most important. And this book that we read from Genesis to Revelation, tells all about it. So it's really wonderful to get a little deeper insight about who is our high priest and why do we even have a high priest. You know, to some here, it's a foreign word. We're not used to that. But to, for example, Landess, she's a former Catholic, or still is a Catholic. She's very familiar with priests. If you're from a Jewish church, you're familiar. If you're from the Greek Orthodox and the Methodist, and there's a lot of priests around. But in modern society, people don't look so much towards a priest unless you're in a particular religion. But what they do for you is they intercede between you and God. And that's what this is all about. And just thinking about another time, another place, in a different context, I think about the man Job. We all remember Job so plainly. The man with the terrible plight, the man with the terrible, horrible ordeal that was beset upon him by Satan with God's permission. What did Job say in chapter 9 and other chapters? He said, "Oh, if there was only someone that would come between me and God and intercede for me because God stopped beating me so." That's what Job said. And guess what? Jesus. Jesus came for humanity to do exactly that. And that's why it's so exciting to know Jesus more and more, and to know the capacity of how he is serving us, because that's exactly what he's doing. I'll go ahead and read chapter 5 verses 5 through 10, and I'm going to read it in the Amplified Bible, starting in verse 5. "So to Christ, or also Christ, the Messiah, did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed and exalted by him who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.'" And that's in Psalms chapter 2, verse 7, if you want to make a note of that. In verse 6, he said, as he says also in another place, "You are a priest appointed forever after the order and with the rank of Melchizedek." And that's in Psalms 110, verse 4. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up definite special petitions for that which he not only wanted but needed, and supplications with strong cryings and tears to him who was always able to save him out from death. And he was heard because of his reverence towards God, his godly fear, and in that he shrank not from the horrors of separation. Excuse me, I'll read that again. In that he, Jesus, shrank from the horrors of separation from the bright presence of his Father. In other words, his fear was that total aloneness. Verse 8, "Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And his complete experience making him perfectly equipped, he became the author and source of eternal salvation to all those who give heed and obey him." And verse 10, "Being designated and recognized and saluted by God as high priest after the order and with the rank of Melchizedek." In spite of the fact, Ted already explained this, I'll say it again, it's in my notes. The King James Version ascribes Hebrews to Paul, that he was the writer. It's almost certainly not written by Paul. Indeed, the identity of the author of Hebrews is a puzzle. There is no conscious excess about the consistency to the modern invention. It goes back to the early church. They wondered, even then afterwards, who wrote it. Hebrews seem to have been written sometime in the 3rd of the 1st century. In other words, right towards the end of that 1st century A.D. And while it is often called the Epistle to the Hebrews, it is not, in fact, a letter. It is instead a sermon. In fact, one of the only sermons in the Bible like that. You know, there's portions of the Bible that, like Sermon on the Mount and so forth. But this whole book is devoted to exhortation and known as a sermon. What's interesting about doing a little research about the who and the what and the why, the Greek of Hebrews is of a particularly fine motive. In other words, different portions of the New Testament is all written in Greek, but in this particular book it was written with expertise. The sentences of this particular text can be long and complex, with lots of how do you say that again?
Grammatical.
There you go. Grammatical sublimation, because in English has a harder time than the Greek in dealing with this complexity. Most English translations are forced to obscure the complexity of the Greek by dividing its long sentences into shorter ones. This makes for a more readable translation of what we do today, but it also can get in the way of the original interpretation. Perhaps the most significant characteristics of this particular passage is its emphasis on the humanity of Jesus. You know, in the last 3 messages I've given you guys, I think I've spoken a lot about the humanity of Jesus. And sometimes it's a little shocking that Jesus could be tempted so that he had to go off and pray about what he was going through. You know, he didn't sin, but like us, he felt the tremendous pull of the temptation. And we talked about even his frailty. But now, this here really concentrates on who we have for our high priest. We have a human that is also a God. We have someone that can understand in every detail what we go through. The story of Jesus descends into suffering of the most intense kind. Betrayal by his friends, conviction by an unjust court, and torture and execution by the cruelest of methods. You know, the Romans hadn't figured out when they invented crucifixion on a cross. There was nothing crueler at that time. Jesus truly did learn obedience through what he suffered, and in doing so, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who will obey him. That's the heart of the gospel, and the author of Hebrews do it. Now let's go back and think about that just for a moment. That verse that said Jesus truly did learn obedience through what he suffered. Think about that for a moment. Does that mean that he didn't know how to obey? No, that's not what it meant. Let's see what it means. To fully understand how Hebrews applies Psalms 110 to Jesus' status as high priest would require a complete study of chapter 7. But to summarize briefly, Jesus could not be a regular Jewish priest because as the Messiah, he is from the tribe of Judah. Okay, there's 12 tribes, and Judah was not one of the priestly tribes. Levi was. So whereas priests must come from the tribe of Levi, so the character of Melchizedek, however, provides an alternative priesthood. Wow. Alternative. Melchizedek is an obscure figure who appears in the story of Abraham in Genesis 14. He is said to be both a king and a priest of God Most High. He's both. It appears nowhere else in Scripture until his name shows up in this psalm, Psalms 110, where the addressee of the psalm is understood by the Jews of the Spirit to be the Messiah. It is said to be a priest in his order. So let's just read about this for a moment from the little source I have here about Jesus, the priestly Son of God. The author of this letter of Hebrews, or better sermon, has discovered a fascinating piece of theology about Christ. Not only has the Father authorized Jesus as the divine Son, that's one, and that's from the David kingly line, right? You know, he promised David he would always have an ancestor on the throne, and he would have an ancestor that would, be forever, speaking of the Messiah. So he comes from David's line of Judah. But he has also authorized him as the divine high priest. So, how can he be both? Messiah or king and also priest. The priest line, of course, would come from a different tribe, of the Levi tribe. Except in this case, in comes Melchizedek. Of course, the priests were not of the house of David, but our writer has discovered that the Melchizedek was both a priest and a king of Jerusalem. And also the older text would say king of Salem, which means peace in Jerusalem. When David captured Jerusalem, this is an interesting point, he inherited both the crown and the priestly role of Melchizedek. Remember how David went in and took it from the By David coming into Jerusalem, taking it over as his kingdom, he inherits the line of Melchizedek, both king and priest, and Jesus comes from that line. So that's how it's passed down. So in his atoning sacrifice upon the cross now serves Jesus and the line of Melchizedek as the eternal, faithful, and merciful high priest who represents lost humanity before the throne of the living God. Okay? Moving on to verses 7 and 9. We move on to address how Jesus met the requirement of the high priest to be able to empathize with those he represents, you and I, and all of humanity. Jesus' anguish described in verse 7 puts him in solidarity with those he represents by sharing their own experience of weakness and suffering. Think about it. You feel that you're worse and you're going through a trial or a tribulation that you just know that God can't possibly understand. He wants you to take it to him because he fully understands. That's the whole point, that we actually have a priest that can understand every bit of what we're going through, and we bring it to him. He is there to help. And it doesn't matter what category your problem is. A lot of times we think of our suffering and trials as something separate from some ridiculous sin or something we did, but that too brings suffering and trials upon us, the sin. We're to bring that to Jesus, who can understand and help us through it. He is there as our total high priest in every way. Anyway, Jesus, the prayers and the cries and the tears of verse 7 are usually understood to be in reference to Gethsemane, though it is possible the author here is referring to a tradition about Jesus not even in our Gospels. That Jesus cries out to be saved from death and were heard refers to his resurrection. In other words, the Father approved of what he did, brought him back to life, and crowned him his Son, King, and Priest of the Most High. He was saved, but only after experiencing death first. Language about Jesus learning obedience and being made perfect in verse 9 often surprises readers today, but the author clearly does not see this as compromising Jesus' sinlessness. So there's not a conflict there. Rather, his being made perfect refers to the fact that in order for Jesus to be a high priest, he had to share in the experience of those he represented. That's you and me, what we go through. Hence, he had to suffer. Being perfected means being fitted properly to the role of high priest, and this requires suffering. So he knew this ahead of time. Before he came to this earth, as 1 John describes, he knew he would have to go through all the suffering. He foretold it over and over to his disciples, who never fully understood it until after his suffering was over. He did this purposely, even though it meant, tremendous pain and affliction. He did it for you and me and all of humanity. The ultimate purpose of Jesus becoming our high priest is given at the end of verse 9. He became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. It takes an eternal high priest to bestow eternal salvation. So he earned that right to give you and I life. Verse 10 simply confirms Jesus' calling as high priest, and eternal, forever high priest called specifically by God. So what can we learn from today? Well, we can learn that we have someone on our side. Oftentimes in people's vision of the supreme God who lives in heaven, it's like such a huge separation if you don't understand how close and personal God really is for us. And he has proved that by what he has done for us in Jesus Christ. Here we have a representative, a big brother, someone that walked this earth, had dust between his toes, laughed and joked, sat down at meals. He knows the human race inside and out because he experienced it firsthand. And he died a death that's probably described as one of the worst deaths anyone could die. But because of his conviction, because of his purpose, the Father gave him this title forever to represent you and me on our earthly walk, until someday we are at one with him in that heavenly place. Jesus, who knows what it is like, is the Jesus who can be an effective high priest. because he can represent our plight to God. Jesus is now there with God, bringing a real understanding of what it means to be human right into the heart of God. And that's curious. You know, we know that God knows all things, but this is really interesting. It is good to know that we have a high priest who is on our side, understanding everything we go through, because he went through much more, and he did this for us so that he could save us and give us eternal life. And I say, wow, now that makes a lot